Hi, everybody. This is Terri Givens, and I'm so excited to welcome you today. We are having a discussion with my friend and colleague, Jean Beaman from UC Santa Barbara, on my new book, The Roots of Racism. So, Jean, I know you got your copy, so we got to show off our
Yes.
copies. It's a real live book. Yay! Anyway, we're happy for those who can join us today, and I know we're a little bit early starting, but that's okay. I'm coming from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where I just arrived on Saturday, and we're getting back to live teaching. And Jean, of course, you're in UC Santa Barbara. What's going on there?
Yes, I'm in Santa Barbara. I won't tell you the weather. It's very warm and sunny.
That's
It's
okay.
very unfair to share how warm it is today. But
Yes,
really,
that's
really thrilled
true.
to be here with you, Terry. Let's just
Yes,
celebrate
and
this book.
yay! Thank you so much. And I have to say, Jean, your work has definitely influenced mine. I really appreciate the work you've done in France. And I remember, I'm one of the old fogies, the senior people who, back in the late 90s when we were doing this stuff, it was, it still is today, of course,
Right.
very taboo, but it's really become a new area of research that hasn't really been examined as much.
Mhm.
And of course, that's part of
Mhm.
the reason I wrote the book. But I'll let you
Yeah.
ask you have some
Yeah,
questions
yeah,
for
no,
me.
thank you for saying that. And it's funny because I've been influenced by your work for years. I've sort of known your work since I was an early grad student, but long before we ever met in person. So that's very generous of you to say. So I want to just start kind of talking about kind of what made you write this book and why now?
So, what made me write this book is as events like, and actually, I started thinking about this book a long time ago because
Hmm.
I was looking, at my broad set of books and so on, going back to, my book on the radical right and then legislating equality and the work I've done on immigration politics. And I
Hmm.
was starting to see this overlap and
Hmm.
how all these things were kind of converging, but also kind of, when the 1619 Project came out and the
Hmm.
attention it gave to the history. But another influence was also the work of Bob Vitalis and Jessica
Hmm.
Blatt, looking at political science and international relations and how those fields had, really ignored their history. That
Hmm.
going back to when they started, race was so prominent, unfortunately, in
Hmm.
a very racist way. So,
Right, right.
but I felt like there was this convergence happening in my own research that led me to think, it would be very helpful, for myself personally, but for others, to kind of look at this history, how my work is kind of stepped in various
Hmm.
points in time, and that these last 20 some years has really been a time of significant change and understanding of how race plays a role and structural discrimination plays a role, not only in the United States and North America, but Europe as well. And because we have to connect to that history. And so for me, it was also an opportunity to connect to the history in a way that I hadn't before. So I spend a chapter just kind of really digging in to
Hmm.
what the history is about, how these things kind of developed over time.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and one of the things I really love, I mean, one of the many things I really love about the book is that you connect your sort of your personal background, your own identity
Mhm.
with that of your research. And so I wonder if you can say a little bit more about those connections.
Yeah, that's something. It's interesting. When I was a grad student, of course, we're supposed to be these very, objective and
Right. Yeah.
scientific and
Yeah.
all this. And
Hmm.
I was like, well, wait a second. The fact, especially when I look back now, it's like I'm asking questions that other people wouldn't ask because they
Right.
don't have my perspective.
Right.
And
Exactly.
so,
Right.
even though my identity shouldn't influence me as a scientist, it does influence the questions I ask, the
Hmm.
way I perceive things that others may not see. And,
Hmm.
I'm finding that that's really true in so many different ways because it not only influences the questions we ask, it influences what areas of research are even looked at.
Right.
So,
Right.
it's about, our, many institutions, including McGill, where I'm at now, are just now considering, oh, maybe we should
Hmm.
have, Black Canadian studies or Black studies
Hmm.
more generally. And
Hmm.
as you know, one of the things I'm really encouraging and talk about in this book is having a more transnational, not just transatlantic, but transnational approach to the study of race and a more empirical approach that allows us to compare across countries.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the transnational approach. And so one of the things I thought was interesting also about the book is that you're sort of talking about studying race in the US and Europe. And we know that, many European countries, the UK being one exception, have this very strong colorblind ethos. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about sort of how you see colorblindness in both contexts in this sort of transnational comparison.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because my students are reading the book for class, so because any of them are
Ah,
watching. Hi, but one of the things one of my students was saying, that, and this is kind of the way I feel about it as well, is after the Holocaust, there was this push to be race blind,
right,
because no more census
right.
with race questions, etc. But the problem is you can't just ignore race and
Hmm.
expect that racism will go away. So we
Hmm.
know that I one of the things I try to do, and not only in this book, but in my book Radical Empathy, I always want to provide evidence. What is the data say? What are the
Hmm.
things that are actually happening? And
Hmm.
we can see that racism is playing a role in policing, in
Right,
housing segregation, in
right.
education, and all these different arenas, and in terms of outcomes. And so, one of the things I try to do is say that these things aren't just happening in these in the there's so much emphasis on the United States, even in the field of political science, right?
Right,
I
right.
mean,
And
we are,
sociology. Yeah.
not just sociology, but history,
Right,
etc.
right.
And
Yes,
so,
yes.
and the other problem with it is that the study of race and racism is considered kind of a side thing. It's not
Mhm,
central to what we
mhm.
do in our fields. And the reality is it impacts everything.
Right,
So,
right.
you can't study Congress and not see that there's issues of, I mean, there's so much. You can't study the French government without
Mhm,
understanding colonialism and how race
mhm,
has played a role. I mean,
mhm,
all these things. Actually, I was listening to a talk today from a job candidate who's talking about how some in the UK and France, the overseas former colonies, or they have
mhm,
a new their conservation measures, and it's
mhm.
connected to colonialism. I mean, all these things have connections to colonialism, and the slave trade, and all these different
Right,
things. And so
right.
um to try and ignore that just says that we aren't really being honest about all the factors that are playing a role in how decisions are made, and
Mhm,
how politics is playing out.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think implicit kind of you said this a little bit earlier, and I want to kind of pull this out. So implicit in the
Mhm.
book and some of what you just said is kind of a critique of the lack of or the lack of progress related to racial diversity in higher education, which of course, as you've already noted, influences
Mhm.
kind of the work and the questions that are being asked. I was wondering if you could kind of say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So in terms of political science, and
Hmm.
the questions we ask, um, I remember back in the day when I was studying. Well, first of all, the reason I studied immigration politics, and the broader issue of anti-immigrant sentiment and so on, was because I couldn't get a handle on race in
Right,
Europe.
right.
And there were very few people I could turn to whose research, I mean, Gary Freeman, was one
Hmm.
of the first to talk about immigration and race in France and the UK. Mark Miller, there's a whole group of people who kind of studied immigration, and even from kind of a labor oriented approach. And so
Hmm.
that was helpful. But, I, especially my second book, Legislating Equality, um, really forced me to push and see where are these where how do we ask these questions, and how I had to kind of use broader political science theories in order to engage with these issues. And so it was really difficult in many ways to get a handle on some of the theoretical issues,
Hmm.
because I didn't have any concepts that had been developed within the field So
Yeah.
and I did draw a lot on, I mean, and I have to be fair, there's people out there, especially in the political theory side, who had been grappling with these issues. But, from a comparative politics perspective, it was, especially compared to American politics and what was going on in theory and so on. I mean, you can think about Charles Mill and I'm going to forget Michael Hanchard and others, have grappled with these issues, but within trying to do something that was very concrete policy approach. I had to kind of develop that on my own, and that's why one of my big pushes now, and I talk about this in the first chapter, is to develop a comparative race theory that builds off of critical race theory.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think just picking up on what you just said, I mean, it's interesting because it's like what you said about sort of, not being able to have access to study race because, and usually it's like, oh, this is a question of migration, or is this a question of Islam, or these other things, but like actually taking race as a central loci to study, I think is one of the many interventions of the book.
Yeah, and I should mention, obviously I did look at a lot of the work of, the perceived threat, things like that. So yeah, there was a lot of work in the American context, especially, and in the UK context as well. Paul Gilroy's work. So it's not like there was nothing out there.
Yeah.
But it's really was something I wanted to take and say, let's, and I feel like, so there was a few of us, back in the late 90s. Now it's growing. Those of us who study this, not and from an interdisciplinary perspective, there's a lot more of us who are starting to look at these questions and but I think one of my next goals, as you know, is to develop a working group that will actually start to develop like an edited volume and a book series that will look at transnational race issues. And so that's something I'm hoping to dig into this summer. But yeah, I think that the broader questions about our disciplinary perspectives on these topics. And I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Lester Spence, who reached out to me last summer and was saying how he wants to start a research agenda and some workshops and so on around, political science and race. And so I was really excited to hear that. And that, I'm not the only one thinking about this. Actually, one of the first things I had my students read was Diane Pinderhugh's APSA speech, and then Paula McLean's APSA speech, which, when I heard Paula's speech, I was like, yes, these issues are
right.
These topics and issues are really coming to the fore. And as I mentioned before, the work by Jessica Blatt and now I'm forgetting his last name, Bob. It'll come back to me. But anyway, hopefully he's not watching. But but anyway, that's my age showing. But Vitalis, thank you, Bob Vitalis. There we go. And it's been an interesting time period since the early 2000s. It's like been this unwrapping and uncovering of the history of political science. And then if you add to that, the work on Du Bois that's been coming out. And I know you can speak to this probably better than I can, but the kind of rediscovery of the origins of our disciplines has just been fascinating. And going back to Du Bois, and it's funny, I talk in the book about being at UCLA and not knowing very much about Ralph Bunche, and then started to dig into his history and finding out, it would have been nice if my professors at UCLA had kind of mentioned that Ralph Bunche was an important figure in political science, and had been a president of APSA, and he's an African American who was also for those who don't know, he was an ambassador to the UN and won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so there was this bust of him, in Bunche Hall. And I was like, isn't that cool? I'm in a building named after this guy who is the Nobel Peace Prize winner, not knowing that he was this amazing political scientist.
Right. And of course, sort of unearthing those stories also does a lot to increase sort of, inclusion and diversity within our disciplines. Recognize that there actually is a long tradition of African-American political scientists, African-American social scientists exploring these questions. Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add that, we look at the numbers and how, we're still a small percentage of the discipline, both
Mhm.
sociology and political science, and think, oh, we're all new, but,
Right.
it's important to understand that history.
Right. Yeah, and I think that dovetails nicely with where I was kind of hoping to go, thinking about the sort of continuity from the history to present, because I think you're both talking about how our study of race, also how race in Europe has obviously a long history in relationship to the history of race in the United States, but then of course that the sort of connection between the two contexts is still relevant presently.
Absolutely, because
Yeah.
and I came to this understanding a while ago in terms of the rise of the far right.
Right.
So, in the
Hmm.
not long after my book came out in 2005, I was following pretty closely what was going on with the radical right in the Europe and in the U.S. as well, because we're starting to see these connections, right?
Right.
And then, even more recently, Geert Wilders has strong connections in the
Hmm.
U.S. with people like Pam
Hmm.
Geller, anti-Islam folks in the U.S. And so then you see him going to the Republican National Convention, and
Right.
this basically even the Trump's uh, ambassador to the Netherlands,
Hmm.
connecting with
Hmm.
all these different things. And so
Right.
seeing, that there are these transatlantic connections in terms of the anti-immigrant far right and anti-Islam far right, was also an important component in kind of getting my brain working around these issues of what are, there's policy learning, right? So you go back when I
Hmm.
was doing my book, Legislating Equality, you go back to the US Civil Rights Movement, and there were, politicians from the UK who came to study what the
Right.
US was
Yeah.
doing around the EEOC, and
Right.
that led to the development of the Commission for Racial
Hmm.
Equality, and then that led to ultimately, the focus of my book, the EU's Racial Equality Directive. So there's
Mhm.
policy learning going on,
Right.
and we need to do more research into that. I mean, my book touches on it, the legislative equality book, but and I mentioned that in this book as
Mhm.
well. So, but Roots of Racism really pulls together all of these different strands of research
Mhm.
from the radical right
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
the anti-discrimination policy in Europe, and how was policy learning from the U.S. that led to the structures they developed, to the work I've done on immigration politics and the conflation of immigration and race. And I think that's what your work really addresses
Mhm.
as well, is how immigration and race have become conflated. And that was
Right.
really obvious to me when I was in. I remember. I mean, we both spent a lot of time, especially in France. But I remember being at talking to somebody, and how they, if you're a person of color, or you're Muslim, they see you as a foreigner, right?
Right.
It's not just that
Right.
they see you as a person of color, or a racialized person, it's that you are a foreigner.
Right. Right.
And
Right. And like the ideas about national belonging are deeply racialized. Yeah.
that's right,
Yeah.
exactly. And I
Yeah.
really think we need to dig into these topics more. I mean, I remember being in Europe during the era when they were having these identity debates. What does it mean to be French? What does it mean
Mhm.
to be British? What does
Mhm.
it mean to be English? All, and
Mhm.
this was all going on, like that 2005, 2006. That was then
Right.
followed up by, Merkel and David Cameron and
Mhm.
Lionel Jospin.
Mhm.
Not Jospin, but Sarkozy, all saying,
Mhm.
multiculturalism has failed. It's
Right.
like, well,
Right.
what do you mean by
Yeah.
multiculturalism?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and of
So
course, just 2005 was the Banlieue uprisings throughout
that's
France
right.
too, which of course then also ushered in the same debates that you just mentioned. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, one of the other things I think is really interesting about kind of what you just said and what also is in the book is thinking about the ways that, and I face this personally as someone, as an American studying race in France, that it's sort of, race is a US concept, or, the dangers of importing, this
mhm,
US framework to the French context, to the European context. And I think you show really nicely that our ideas about race in the United States come from Europe, and actually that, race is very much a European concept. It's not just a US
mhm,
concept. And so I think that
mhm.
also provides a different way of thinking about how to compare differently organized societies around some of these same social questions.
Yeah, I agree. It's important that's why, you know, the issue of ideas and race are
Hmm.
really important.
Hmm.
And that's why I love Nell Painter's work on, what does it mean to be white?
Yeah.
The,
Yeah.
and um, understanding that in the broader context of how identity politics is playing out today. I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, Ashley Jardina's work,
Right. Yeah.
because it's so, and its focuses on the U.S., but we need to be doing these same kinds of studies in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
identity politics, it's funny, because as you know, Macron, president of France right now, he's coming out very strongly. We don't want these American ideas about
Right. That's what I was
race
thinking
coming.
about. And yeah, the
And
debate
it's like, well,
around critical race theory in France. And yeah. That's what I was thinking about when I was reading
absolutely.
your book. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And it's really interesting that there's this pushback against just simply studying these things, and
Mm-hmm.
that's been true
Right.
going back to when Gary Freeman did his book in 1979. There was a lot of pushback because he used the word race in his
Right.
title, and then that has played out over time, and now we see this pushback at we don't want this critical race theory coming to France and so
Mm-hmm.
on. It's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
what are you talking about? It's just a
Right.
theory. It's
Right.
we're just
Right.
testing ideas and models and so
Right.
on. And
Right. Right.
but anyway.
Yeah, no, and I think it's good that you, just especially for viewers who aren't as familiar with the European context, really getting at like it's not just so much that the study of race is so illegitimate. It's actually like this, even the word, even using the
Hmm.
word, is seen as dangerous. I mean, it's like just such an amazing disavowal of the relevance and salience of race in many European societies. Yeah,
Yeah, and I want
yeah,
to make sure I give a shout out to our friend Rokaya Diallo, who's been
yes,
on the
of
ground.
course.
And I think she's spending some time in the U.S. right now, but she's been on the ground. I've known her, since what, like 2003, 2000, something like back in the day. She's been out there really on the front lines,
Hmm.
talking about these issues, and she's doing really great work.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, it's just so hard to do that kind of anti-racist work in France and other European societies, precisely for the reasons you just mentioned. I
Absolutely.
don't. Yeah, let me ask one more. Let me ask a question about kind of the far right, and you sort of
Mhm.
alluded to. I mean, you sort of started to talk about this. Where do you see this going? I mean, I'm thinking about this. I'm always thinking about Europe vis-a-vis France, and thinking about the upcoming presidential elections,
Mhm.
and Marianne Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, and so I would just be curious your analysis of kind of where you think things stand, having this kind of historical perspective.
It's worrying,
Yeah,
frankly.
yeah,
So I always say how when I was studying the far right back in the late '90s, everybody's like, "Oh, they're just a flash in the pan. They're going to
hmm
disappear soon, and
hmm
your work won't be relevant."
hmm well,
So,
that's nice. Yeah, right, yeah,
I mean, that wasn't the whole reason, but the real reason I shifted to studying anti-discrimination policy is in 1999 when Jörg Haider's party made it into the
mm
Austrian parliament. That led the EU to pass the racial equality directive, and
hmm
so that was at the same time that I was doing my research on my first book, voting radical right in Western Europe. And so I was like, whoa. Here people have been telling me all this time that you can't use the word race, and then the EU
right,
turns around and
right,
passes legislation on the racial equality directive, and I'm just like,
hmm
okay, so I'm going to have to take a deeper look at this. And
right,
so that's what led to my next book. But back then like I said, people just figured, it's kind of like the way we looked at Trump when, early,
I was,
you
yeah,
know,
I was gonna mention
it's
that.
like,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
this is a joke, and blah, blah, blah.
right,
And
right,
then, a few years later, you find out, oh, oops.
right, right,
So, so
right.
it's a big, it's become a much bigger topic. Obviously, there's a lot more people looking at it. I mean, and I have to say, it's not just the radical right or the far right that people have started to focus on more. Sociology was way ahead of political science when it came to studying immigration politics.
Mhm,
And so, but since the late '90s, I remember, there was kind of the forerunners of, Gary Freeman and Martin
mhm,
Shane and others like that.
mhm,
And now we see, there's a whole new generation, including some of my own students, who are out there studying, immigration policy and in a comparative perspective. And
right,
but I have to give a shout out to people like Dan Tishner. For years and years, I used Dan
mhm,
Tishner's book on immigration politics. So in a sense, that's why I had to write this book, right? Because I see all these strands coming together of,
right,
okay, immigration, we're just starting to really get a handle on it. I mean, things like surveys,
Mm-hmm.
we really have had to change the way we look at survey data because, it was in the early 2000s when we just had started looking at like the Latino vote
Oh, yeah.
and the Asian vote. And
Yeah.
so, from an immigration perspective, we didn't have, we didn't really know what was going on with these people once they became citizens and voters
Mhm.
and so on. And there was this expectation back then, not only, you had to look at the radical right, but for left parties, there was this expectation that, people who came in as immigrants would, vote left.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you had kind of this shift of in France, even communist voters switching all the way to the far right.
Right.
So, in terms of the voting dynamics, to understand the far right, you had to understand what was happening with the
Mhm.
left. And,
Mhm.
the expectations the left had that, and I think actually the state of California played a role in that with Prop 187 and the shift
Oh,
from, to
yeah.
a predominantly Democratic state
Yeah.
from being, a state that was reliably, kind of
Mhm.
switched back and forth, but
Mhm.
reliably Republican. And in any case, yeah, and somebody actually really good question in the chat about Europeans not collecting information on race, because this
Right.
is something we both address. So that's another
Right.
factor
Right.
when I was trying to do research in the late 90s is that there wasn't any census data I could
Mhm.
use. And
Mhm.
so we end up using proxies. And Rasan Maxwell is somebody else who's done a lot of work on
Mhm.
this topic. But Europeans don't collect data on race because we did mention it at the beginning because of the Holocaust and the fact that the census was used to identify Jews and others when they were rounding people up. So
Mhm.
that's one factor at play, but also this idea of being race blind that Jean mentioned
Right.
at the beginning.
Right. Well, yeah,
So,
the ideas of like universalism and these sorts of things. But
mhm.
just to kind of going back a bit to what you just said earlier about the sort of the far right and the implications in terms of immigration. I mean, that makes me also think about like Brexit, right? Right. And like
Exactly.
the sort and similar and the same dynamics you just mentioned are playing out in that context as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because of course, one of the biggest topics as Brexit, the
Hmm.
lead up to the vote was happening was this folk. And the interesting thing, though, it was intra EU
Right.
migration that
Right.
was the factor, right? And I
Right.
remember, and going to London, around 2008 or so, and these discussions about Polish plumbers and I
Mm.
did see a lot of
Oh
Eastern
yeah.
Europeans working in London, but we could talk for for another
Yeah.
half hour
Yeah.
just about Brexit. But obviously,
Yeah.
the sentiment around immigration
Mhm.
was clearly,
Mhm.
playing a role in the Brexit vote. And I know there's
Mhm.
people who've written about it and so
Mhm.
on. So that's another interesting component there.
Mhm, mhm. So I guess just to ask kind of one last quick question. So,
Mhm.
this is weirdly unfairly broad, but what is your assessment of our present moment? I mean, you obviously like wrote this book in a particular, at this particular time. I mean, where are we going? I mean, you've talked about sort of the, growing attention to studies of race and political science and cognitive disciplines. Like, what is your assessment about kind of where we are now, where we're going? It's kind
Yeah.
of an unfair question, but I would love to
No, it's
hear
not.
your
Not at
thoughts.
all. It's a good question. And I want to address Karen's comment that race, yes, we know race is totally a social construct. We are all the same.
Right.
But in any case, where are we going? Well, I see, like I said, I'm so excited because my colleague Lester Spence and a whole group of folks
Mhm.
are getting together to discuss, kind of where we're going with race. So there's a lot of interest within the discipline and,
Mhm.
for all these different strands that are developing, and I'm hoping that what it will lead to is kind of a more interdisciplinary approach, but from a sub-discipline perspective, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. Americanists
Mhm.
working with people who study
Oh,
Canada and people who
right.
study the UK, and
Mhm.
trying to find. That's why I say I want us to take a more, theory testing and approach. Let's develop some theories around race and really go out and test them,
Mhm.
because I think part of the problem with all of our disciplines right now is we take race as something we study for granted.
Right.
It's
Right.
it's just kind of there, and okay, let's study racism. And we can see the outcomes, but
Mm-hmm.
we need to take a step back and do some of the theoretical work around, what does race mean in different
Mm-hmm.
contexts. And
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of happening. I mean, there's a really great, and I've drawn on this literature as well, in Latin America, on
Mm.
skin tones or shades,
Right. Like
and
pigmentation and
exactly.
yeah,
And
yeah.
in Europe, where people are from, people from
Mm-hmm.
Africa sometimes are, or sub-Saharan Africa are accepted better than people from, say,
Mm-hmm.
Algeria, because of
Mm-hmm.
um uh there's just a antipathy towards, people who
Mm-hmm.
came from Algeria because of the war
Mm-hmm.
for independence, and so
Mm-hmm.
on. So
And the colonial violence and yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important that we start off by, like, when we do this edited volume, I would love to have folks just take a step back and say, how should we be defining these
Mm-hmm.
things from a theoretical perspective?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
and
and I hope
here,
that oh, sorry. And I hope
oh,
that
go ahead.
engenders more kind of inclusion around who is doing this kind of work, which I think is also what you speak to in the book. Yeah,
Absolutely. And so
yeah.
I think as the discipline all of our disciplines become more diverse, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
see a deeper interest and understanding of some of these topics. But we are at 30 minutes, and as
That
my
was great.
students reminded me, I have to go to class today.
Yeah. Well, this has
So
been
this has been
lovely.
really
Thank you
fun.
so much. And thanks to everyone
Yes,
for coming. This has been fun.
yes. Thanks, everybody. And I'm going to go ahead and sign off.
Okay.
Have a
Bye.
great day.